Good morning, my name is Carolyn Klauba and I'm the Stewardship Program Coordinator for the Saraland Conservancy. Today we're at Baldpate Mountain with Dr. Mike Van Clef of Friends of Hopewell Valley Open Space. Today he's going to talk to us about deer management.
My name is Mike Van Clef. I'm the Stewardship Director for Friends of Hopewell Valley Open Space. Deer management is differentiated from recreational hunting. So our goal generally is to reduce the deer population. It's significantly higher than it should be, approximately 10 to 15 times higher than it should be. So our goals are two and related. One is access. So a large part of the Hopewell Valley, we estimate about 40% of the land area has no hunting access. So we try to encourage access. So that's obviously a key part of the strategy. When you do have access, it's really critical that if you're trying to reduce the deer population, that you do not just recreational hunting, but deer management. And what deer management means is fairly straightforward. You establish quotas for harvesting. So rather than just whatever a recreational hunter might want to take to fill his freezer or give a deer to a friend, take a nice buck, instead of just that, you're basically saying, well, you must harvest at least 2 antlerless deer, for example. So not every hunter has the time or money or skill to take a lot of deer. So what we try to do is, over time we build a program by essentially eliminating hunters that can't meet the standard of a management hunter and provide more land to hunters that can do it. So you end up with a program where the hunters just do their thing and they want to take a lot of deer. They're motivated to do it. They want to do it. They can do it. And ultimately you get significantly higher harvest than if you just had a recreational hunting program where you said, okay, the land's open for hunting, go hunt. So that's it in a nutshell. One of the differences between recreational and hunting and deer management is the focus on does. So the females of the population are obviously the ones driving the population growth rate. So in order to reduce the population, you have to reduce the number of female deer. So antlerless is a sort of a term that means does and very young bucks. So we follow the state regulations on that. A young buck and a doe are both considered antlerless. Some programs do take it a step farther and just say, does only. Which is fair, so it's getting at the main driver of the population without sort of the ancillary young bucks being taken as well. It's estimated that there were 10 deer per square mile pre-European settlement. When we do counts every year in the Hopewell Valley, we find in excess of 100 deer per square mile, and unfortunately, that's the low point of the deer population, is the end of March when it's the standard to do these measurements. So you've had a full hunting season, you've had, depending on the harshness of the winter, you might have had some loss in the deer population through the cold weather, and it's before they give birth, early in the summer. So when we say there's 105 deer per square mile in the Hopewell Valley, that's what we measured at the end of March. What that equates to after birthing in June is 155 deer per square mile. Going back 10 deer per square mile is where we're going. So I often will say, the problem is we have 10 to 15 times more deer in the Hopewell Valley than there should be. And the ecological damage, not to mention Lyme disease and vehicle collisions and agricultural losses and landscape planting losses, last but not least, we have ecological damage, significant ecological damage. And it really is the primary, it's really the primary need for stewardship. It really can't be put many other ways. We have invasive species problems, but guess what? Invasive species problems are always, they're heightened significantly by deer overpopulation. And the reason for that is deer, like every animal that eats anything, has preferences for one thing over another. And if there was 100 potential food items down there, a deer would have a preference from 1 to 100. What's the most, give it the most nutritional value, essentially. And as it turns out, invasive species are non-native species that deer do not find palatable. So there are some native species that deer don't like to eat, but that's a very short list. So the main things like oaks and maples, viburnums, et cetera, asters, all the wildflowers, they're very palatable to deer. So if you have 10 to 15 times too many deer, and they prefer to eat native species over invasive species, therein lies the problem. So what we found is there are sort of two different kinds of degraded forests that you're likely to run into. One is called the empty forest syndrome, and that occurs in places where there was never any agricultural tilling. You might have a very healthy canopy of trees, but you have nothing in the understory, almost nothing. So that's completely empty in the understory. So that's the empty forest syndrome. The other type of degraded forest is the infested forest syndrome. And that generally occurs where agricultural tilling has occurred in the past. The soils are profoundly altered and favor weedy species, so that they're already giving the invasive species a leg up. And then you throw a large deer population on top of that, and they remove all the native species, so you have a forest whose understory is full, but full of unpalatable invasive species. And of course, ecology is never quite that simple, but that really broadly defines how deer and invasive species and past land use all interact. So one of the ways that we tried to counteract the negative impacts of deer is through restoration. Now, restoration really can only be done when you have grant funding, to be quite honest. There aren't really many nonprofits that have money laying around to do tens of thousands of dollars worth of restoration work. But we've worked with Mercer County parks, and we often, on a project like this, will jointly do things or complementarily do things. So we get one grant, they get another grant. So this project went in about 8 or so years ago, and it started with a fence to keep the deer away. This had been sort of an irregularly mowed field, so it was mostly sort of hay field that sort of was, aging out and just irregularly mowed. But you weren't going to get trees growing in this very freely because of the excessive amount of deer. Even when you do good deer management, it's very difficult to have a field, a former agricultural field, turn into a forest. It generally will turn into shrubland of autumn olive or multiflora rose because deer don't prefer to eat them. So the beauty of this is, you put a fence up and nature reminds you that it remembers how to work. Look at all these trees that came in. It's magnificent. Is it completely free of invasives? Nope, I see some multiflora rose. And I'm sure there's other things mixed in there. But without a fence, you're not going to turn a field into a forest. You're going to turn it into a thicket of invasive species. So, restoration, when you can do it, where you can do it, plays a vital role. And the reason why, Friends of Hopewell Valley works at Baldpate with the county is because it's the biggest, most valuable piece of woods around. So we are very strategic about where we put the kind of resources needed to do a restoration. You look at a map and see how the forest is distributed, and you see, there's a big patch of green at Baldpate Mountain, and in very small pieces throughout the valley. So if you're going to put your limited resources somewhere, you're going to sort of, the very old song, accentuate the positive. You're not going to try to turn something that has very low probability of long-term success without immense amount of perpetual resource, you're going to choose the spot that has the best things going for it and try to amplify that. So every restoration, you put plants in, you plant some trees, but in the scheme of things, and it was a lot. It was many hundreds, if not into the thousands, I'm guessing, of trees we put in across, an 8-acre area. That's a drop in the bucket. What you're really doing with planting is you're sort of goosing the system. You're getting it up and going, but you're relying on the seeds from all the mature trees around us to get into here to really establish the forest, because there's probably tens of thousands of trees in here, unplanted, and that's kind of what you want. We selected this area because essentially it was a hole in the donut. There aren't many meadow-type areas here at Baldpate, which is why it has value. It has a large block of forest. So we wanted to, fill in those areas and make the forest as large as possible with as much core area as possible. I think we understand that, even though it's a post-agricultural area, the removal of deer obviously shifted the balance. So even in a post-agricultural area, if you remove the deer impact, the soil impact could be sort of override, just because you don't have deer eating every last native plant that grows in there. Would they grow better on an area that had never been plowed? Probably, but they're growing pretty good now, just because they don't have deer on them. Why is an empty forest bad? A forest would naturally have layers from the ground layer all the way up to the canopy and everything in between. It would be dense with vegetation. One of the ways you're in an empty forest, especially this time of year, is when you're on a trail in an empty forest and the leaves have freshly fallen on the trail and now you have no idea where the trail is anymore because everything's open. You're in an unhealthy forest when that happens. A forest would naturally have an herbaceous layer, a shrub layer, tree seedlings and saplings, subcanopy trees, canopy trees. And all of these things, they're not just, words of layers of a forest, they're species. Each one of those species being providing resources to pollinators, providing food to a variety of insects that then provide food to a variety of birds, etc. So in order to have a completely functioning diverse system, you need all of those layers, and when they're missing, you're going to lose things. There's a reason why we've lost a third of our bird population in the last 50 years. There's a reason why we've lost tremendous amounts of insects over the same time period. Yeah, there are a lot of factors, but just on the ground in everyone's backyard everywhere are forests that are missing tons of the thing that makes up food webs. So it's not a surprise that you're going to lose, birds and insects. If we want to, we can blame, it's deforestation in the Amazon and where they're migrating to, and that's the problem. Well, yeah, that's a problem, but what are we responsible for? Oh, right, we've fostered an overabundance of deer that's ludicrous, and we've completely degraded all our forests. So how about we do the things we could do to be responsible stewards? All those missing layers feed the food web. They're a huge component of the food web. So what's wrong with an infested forest, right? At least you have something in the understory in an infested forest. One of the things that makes a plant invasive is not only that deer don't like to eat them, but insects don't like to eat them. So if insects aren't eating the leaves of an autumn olive, for example, well then there's no bird to eat that insect. So again, it's a broken food web. In an empty forest, there's nothing. In an infested forest, for most insects, it's still nothing. It's the things that can't be eaten. And you have, again, a broken, degraded food web. We feed deer plenty. The reason why the Hopewell Valley could support 100 to 150 deer per square mile is because we feed them a lot. A completely intact forest for tens and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of acres is very poor habitat for a deer. They feed on forest edges, they feed in meadows naturally. So part of the reason why there were 10 deer per square mile, 400 years ago is because there wasn't really agricultural fields at a big scale. There weren't subdivisions and houses and things like that. So one of the ironies is, our agriculture really feeds deer very well, and that really keeps the numbers up. If there were no agriculture and only the forest pieces left, the deer would be starving to death because their forests have been stripped of things that are palatable, and they wouldn't be able to make it. They fatten up on agricultural crops. Now, obviously, the farmers don't condone that behavior, but they do, and they, eating our landscaping. Our forests aren't really supporting the huge deer herd. We're supporting it through agricultural crops and our landscaping. Birth control is completely impractical at any scale. It may work at the scale of if you have a penned-in herd, like, more like a farm kind of situation. But the amount of effort and money and ultimate lack of results shows that, birth control methods just don't work. And there have been as recently as the last several years on Staten Island where they were actually doing castrations on male deer. It just doesn't work. And I think I respect hunting just for its own sake. I have a lot of respect for hunting and hunters. I think it's a real true way. If you're going to eat meat, it's sort of an honest way to do it, as opposed to just buying something on a styrofoam tray with plastic wrap on it. There are no other options. And I'm personally driven by, the broken food web, all of the missing birds, all of the missing insects. We can't say, well, deer are, fluffy and pretty, so what's wrong with having more of them? Well, the consequence is you have less butterflies, and you have less thrushes and bluebirds and everything else. So you really, even if you were resistant to the idea of hunting, which I personally am not, but even if you were resistant to that, I think the appeal is still towards not favoring one species at the expense of every single other one out in the forest. Deer management has not been shown to work at a large scale because there's not enough people doing it. Not that deer management doesn't work, it's just that collectively as humans, we are unwilling and unable to execute it over a scale such like, the Hopewell Valley, even that kind of a scale. So we have local successes where we do deer management, especially where the area that's being managed is larger. You can have success at a small scale, but the thing that's missing is the large scale. And the reason why we have this problem is because every landowner could do whatever they want on their own property, hunt, not hunt, recreational hunt versus management hunt. Be honest with you, it's really hard to find enough management hunters at scale to have an impact. So we do what we can where we can, and we hope to continue convincing people to open up access to the land to allow hunting at all, and when they do, to do a deer management program. One of the issues in anywhere in New Jersey, but is safety zones. So if you have a house, there's neighbors near you, those neighbors have to be a minimum of 150 feet away from you to allow bow hunting, and a minimum of 450 feet away to allow gun hunting. So we had a intrepid volunteer years ago, Simca, and she looked at all the aerial photos of the Hopewell Valley and put a dot on every structure. And using GIS, you put a buffer on those dots. So we have the entire valley mapped out for safety zones. If someone calls me up and says, I'm interested in having hunting, I say, where do you live? Let me see your safety zone issue. If you don't have any safety zone issues, then yeah, you're free to allow hunting. So in many cases it works out, in many cases it doesn't. But you obviously have to follow the safety rules, obviously, for deer hunting. So I've been doing stewardship for some years, decades. And I think it's very easy to sort of run yourself into the ground with bad news. Oh my goodness, another new invasive species. Oh my goodness, the deer are just completely stripping this forest bare. And I think the commonality of all people who do this sort of professionally is you could always make it better. Considering how bad it is, it's pretty easy to make it a little bit better, to be honest with you. And I think the Friends of Hopewell Valley, we really try to, and others obviously too, we try to really encourage private landowners to chip in. We have our community conservation program, a couple hundred members, totaling somewhere just over north of 3,000 acres worth of land in the valley, that participate in this program. And they're all people, the thing they all have in common is that they're trying to do their bit. So that could be a postage stamp lot, in Hopewell Borough, and they plant, a couple dozen native plants in their garden. That is fantastic, because you know what? Some butterflies are going to come to that, and they're going to be fed by it. It could be people doing really effective deer management on their own private lands. It could be people doing restorations. There's some landowners that have, put up fences like this in their forest and have planted lots of native wildflowers within them. So, I think without the help of a broader group of people, the success of stewardship is diminished. And the more people doing it, the more stewardship efforts are enhanced. So it really is about everyone doing their bit. And some people do a bit, and some people are just outrageous, off-the-hook land stewards that can't stop, and they're awesome. But every little bit helps.
Yeah,